Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Ms. Faderman, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yes, I'm Lillian Faderman, and I'm a historian, and I'm the author of several books of lesbian and LGBTQ and women's history.
Now, how did you get interested in this particular area?
Well, I came out in the 1950s into the lesbian community, and it was probably the worst time ever in the history of this country to be a homosexual, as the word was to describe all of us, whether we were L or G or B or T or Q. The alphabetism didn't exist in those days. We were all homosexual to the outside world and gay within our world. But I say it was the worst time to be a homosexual because there was no place we could turn that was accepting. To all of the churches, except maybe the Unitarians, we were sinners. To the federal government, we were all subversives, particularly if we worked for the government, because it was thought that homosexuals were so ashamed of who they were, and it was such a terrible thing to be a homosexual that we were subject to blackmail, and we would give away state secrets if someone said that they would expose our homosexuality. To the psychiatric profession, we were all crazies because homosexuality was in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of mental disorders, and that was the Bible of all psychiatrists and psychologists and psychiatric social workers and everyone else that was in the mental health profession. To the police everywhere in this country, we were criminals because every single state had a sodomy law on the books in the 1950s. And it was assumed that all homosexuals were therefore presumptive criminals. And sodomy, I should say, meant not only anal sex, but any kind of sexual activity that wasn't heterosexual intercourse. And so there was absolutely nowhere we could turn in the 1950s for any kind of solace or support. So that was when I came out. I came out into the gay girls bar culture, and I had no idea that we had a history. I had no idea that this wasn't the first generation of women who had discovered lesbian life. And I was a literary kid, and so I went to the library looking for things that would reveal the possibility of other generations of lesbians or gay people. And I found absolutely nothing, but there were pulp novels, and they were usually awful because they ended tragically, about lesbian life, and they were very sensationalistic. There was a lot of stuff from mental health professionals about how homosexuality was a mental illness, and that was it. And I thought, and I was a teenager in the 1950s, and I thought, wow, it would be so wonderful if someone wrote a book about people before us who both gay men and lesbians who lived lives that in which they were able to express their same-sex desires and affectional preferences, as the phrase sometimes was then. But such books didn't exist, and if they did exist, they couldn't get published because there were censorship laws. But things changed drastically in the late 1960s. and into the 1970s. There had always been, beginning in the early 50s, just this very small homophile movement, it was called, in which gay people tried to band together and fight for our rights, but it was a very small movement. In 1969, the Stonewall riots happened in Greenwich Village, and it was kind of, as one wit said, the hairpin drop heard round the world. It really brought homosexuality into the newspapers. We were really censored before, except for occasional articles about how our bars were raided or how we were kicked out of government jobs. And the other thing that happened in the 1960s was the rise of the feminist movement. And so for me, the two things converged. And by the 1970s, there were gay and lesbian publishing houses and newspapers that were published by gays and lesbians, open gays and lesbians. And what I realized is that this was the time to do what I had so much wanted to find in the 1950s, to write about same-sex desires and women who had lived together and men who had lived together or had sexual relationships in other eras. And that started me on the career of research. I began by doing lesbian history, and then eventually I branched out to LGBTQ history, and I was always interested in women's history.
I would think that being gay or having maybe writing down that a journal or something like that would be hard to find because I doubt a lot of people, probably with the way that it was looked at, were seen as like if you wrote that down and someone found out, you were basically going to be killed. But as much as we know about history, I mean, we knew kings had male servants that they had, weird desires with, and there was even with
That's so weird, though.
yeah, not so weird, but that's what I mean. Whether it's little, I mean, the little kid thing is where I meant by weird. But when it comes to like Spartans were gay, and that's like something that doesn't get shown in the movies. It doesn't get told like that, and it was seen as a combat strategy, is that you would fight harder if you were, had a connection or bond or relationship more than just friends, but lovers, and that's how they fought, and that's historical stuff. But I didn't find that out until doing my show, and that's like relatively not even that long ago. It's not taught in history books. They don't teach you that, and they don't really share this side of history, which is interesting because I start wondering what was the propaganda like where there was so much of this. I know about a little bit about the AIDS pandemic, and I know kind of the brainwashing that kind of went into that as well too. But the propaganda in the 50s, the propaganda, when did it start? What were they saying? What was going on that made people feel like they were a freak or a monster? I mean, that shun of society, that's still here today in some aspects, but it's changed drastically with all the movements. I have to think with the rise of the underground press and a bunch of other things of independent sources that are being able to speak like, hey, if this person shares their story and then you hear their story and you can resonate with it, then you're not alone. And that's kind of like one of the most important things.
Yes, I think that's exactly true, and I think that Harvey Milk, about whom we'll speak more today, I think he was so prescient in realizing in the early 1970s that it was important for gay people, as we were still all called in the 1970s, or gay and lesbian people by the mid 70s. It was really important for us to come out, because unless we came out, heterosexuals had the dubious luxury of believing they knew of no one who was gay. Gay people were those guys who dwelt in twilight, as the term was, who hid behind corners waiting for some 14-year-old to pass by to pounce on him. What Harvey realized is that once we came out in great numbers, America would have to understand that we're your sons, we're your daughters, we're your brothers, we're your sisters, we're your neighbors, we're your co-workers, we're your beloved friends. And that's what started to happen. It wasn't just Harvey Milk who called for everyone to come out. It was this burgeoning gay movement that really took hold by the 1970s, and more people came out. with the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. They were forced out of the closet. And America realized that, wait a minute, these are people we love. These are our kids. These are our brothers and sisters. We can't continue to make them pariahs. We have to help fight for their rights. One survey taken by the Gallup poll, I believe it was in the 1990s, said that only 20% of Americans claimed that they knew someone who was gay or lesbian. Now, more recent surveys by the Pew Research Survey, for instance, said that more than 75% of Americans say that they personally know someone who's gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer. And because of that, America has come to support us. I think because of that, the laws have been liberalized. If anyone had told me in the 1950s, when I came out as a teenager, that the day would come when we would be able to marry our same-sex partners, for instance, I would have thought that person was smoking too much pot. I mean, it was simply inconceivable in the 1950s that we would eventually become practically first-class American citizens. And I think we have. Of course, as we see, even by the case that's in front of the Supreme Court today, we're not quite first-class American citizens. There are some people who are claiming their, quote, religious right to not deal with us as first-class American citizens. But I don't think that's where most Americans are in terms of LGBTQ rights nowadays.
Well, when it comes to the question, do you think that a lot of this is because of the religious, I guess, connection, especially back in the day? I mean, even government officials, what people would label hardcore right wing, they're just people that believe strongly in like the nuclear family idea.
I
Um,
think it's primarily the religious right that is arguing today in front of the Supreme Court. The argument is that one's religious conviction should mean that you don't have to serve same-sex couples. You don't have to. The particular case today is a woman who does wedding websites, and she refuses to do it for same-sex couples on the basis of her personal religious convictions. So, yeah, I think it's primarily the religious right that doesn't want to recognize the rights of LGBTQ
Is
Americans.
that also with today? I mean, the number of people that are religious, I think, is that the number the last time I checked was like 42%. Either they worship, but they worship at home. Like they just don't like the religious church idea really anymore. I know it was that sense of community, but it kind of divulged a little bit farther from that. So people just don't feel comfortable in that community anymore. But there's a large amount of Americans that are not religious, where I feel like it opens up that doorway for them to not, because the whole hostility against people with whoever they love, depending on whatever their gender is or whatever, that all boils down to the religious aspects of things. Like it's not in the Bible. God said it was a sin. And that's from the people that I've heard that still believe that agree with that because of the Bible aspect. And I'm just like, I've never been religious. So that whole argument goes out the window for me.
Yeah, it's still, I think, primarily that it's no longer the law because the sodomy laws were all repealed in 2003 with Lawrence v. Texas. It's no longer the absurd belief that all homosexuals are mentally disordered, because that was repealed in 1973 when the American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality from its diagnostic and statistical manual. It's no longer that the government thinks that homosexuals are going to give away state secrets. So I think it's primarily the churches, and certainly not all churches. It's fundamentalist churches primarily. I think many churches have come to welcome LGBTQ people in recent years.
Oh, I mean, the number, if you look at the institutions back then, institutions, people that were committed to insane asylums, I mean, the number of people that must have been given lobotomies because they were gay, or the number of people that must have been locked in an insane asylum because they were gay. And you start to realize that a lot of these institutions started playing the role of just getting rid of things that they didn't want to see. I mean, that was a lot. ADHD, things of even disorders today that are more common. There were issues with people being locked in insane asylums or given a lobotomy. And it's like, just changes like the whole history of things when you start diving into the actual stuff that, the deeper you go into it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think families very often thinking they were doing the loving thing, thinking they were supporting a family member who was a quote homosexual, often had family members committed to mental institutions. In my research, I ran across a number of cases where gay men in particular were arrested under sodomy laws or lewd vagrant laws, as they were called then, and they were committed to mental institutions. So it was rife that homosexuals were either committed by family members or committed by police departments, juries. It was thought because homosexuality was considered by the psychiatric profession as a mental disorder, it was thought that you had to treat homosexuals by locking them up in mental institutions.
Did you find any periods in history where the culture started to kind of rise and conflict? Like whenever you saw like a total, I would say, I wouldn't say a wash, but a total trying to annihilate, I guess, the people that were trying to speak out because of being gay. We see that with many of the underground movements that started happening in the 60s and 70s, a lot of activists during the Vietnam War. There was obviously government things that were going on that were trying to suppress that. I'm just curious if you came across any moments
Yes,
in history.
absolutely. Yes, the 1950s were particularly bad because, as I had said earlier, homosexuality was thought to be so terrible that homosexuals would be a threat to this country, would be subversives, would give away state secrets if they were found to be homosexual by our enemies, which was usually characterized as communists in the USSR. Um, the USSR would blackmail a homosexual into doing terrible things because if anyone knew you were a homosexual, you were really in huge trouble socially and politically and in terms of your job and in every other way. And so I found, for instance, that the FBI really took out after homosexuals. There were files of homosexual leaders and the tiny homosexual organizations. There was a lesbian organization, for instance, that began in 1955 called Daughters of Bilitis. There was an FBI file on Daughters of Bilitis and the leaders of Daughters of Bilitis, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon. Um, if you were found to be homosexual, you could lose your job, not only a government job, but a job anywhere, because homosexuality was thought to be so immoral, so decadent, such a disease in the 1950s. There were even companies such as Fidelifacts that uh, sold their services to corporations and even smaller employers, saying, do you know who your employees are? Do you know who this applicant for a job is? We will do a background check. And what they looked particularly for in background checks was not only communist activity or dope addiction or alcoholism, but particularly homosexuality.
Is this
And if
Hoover?
they
Is this
found,
Hoover's like organizations or strategies?
I'm sorry, is this what?
Is this Hoover's strategies? Because that's his whole get go is communism and homosexuals.
It was J. Edgar Hoover, of course, but Fidelifacts was a private company selling its services to employers, to corporations, and even smaller employers. So there was just this sentiment which was ubiquitous everywhere in this country that homosexuals were pariahs. They were dangerous, they were sick, they would seduce children, and that was the big thing, of course, that they were all waiting to pounce on 14-year-old kids. There was really nowhere that gay people could turn and be safe in the 1950s.
Well, most of the propaganda, if you kind of look at the guidelines a little bit more, they all kind of boil down to children. And it's whenever that sacred thing gets mentioned or anything against kids, that's when people start just blind rage and freak out without like I've had a propaganda guy on the show and he was talking about an example with kids. And I was like horrified. And then I had to remember, wait a minute, this is propaganda. This isn't real what he's explaining. And it was that quick instinct of like, because it is that preserve they can't defend themselves, that aspect of things. And that's not
I, I think
it's like
I think you're exactly right. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I'm so interested in what's going on in Florida now with these terrible "Don't Say Gay" bills and the way it's spreading to other states. But Florida is just a prime example of what you're talking about. In the late 1950s and through much of the 1960s, there was a Florida legislative committee called the Johns Committee that looked into faculty in colleges and universities that were supported by the state of Florida, and also high schools and elementary schools, and made sure to get rid of all homosexuals who were discovered to be teaching in any kind of state-supported institution, colleges, but high schools, elementary schools, universities, anywhere. And it was a real witch hunt in the late 1950s and through the 1960s. In the 1970s, it came up again with Anita Bryant and the Save Our Children movement, and she spread her venom all over the country. Anita Bryant really attacked in the beginning the Miami-Dade ordinance that included gay people in its rules about non-discrimination in the city of or the county of Miami-Dade, non-discrimination against people on the basis of race or religion or national origin. It included sexual and affectional preference in the mid 1970s, and Anita Bryant formed this Save Our Children organization and said that homosexuals are a danger and you have to make sure that they're not permitted to teach because they're going to seduce kids in schools. And we see it again with the Don't Say Gay bills. And, you know, the absurdity of that to claim that homosexuality and pedophilia are connected when statistically most pedophiles are heterosexual men. But of course, it really appeals to hysteria. And it has in the 1950s, it has in the 1970s, and it does as well today. As far as we've come, there are still these hysterical elements in society that want to connect homosexuality with grooming, is the term today.
when it comes to the FBI that you mentioned before about I guess invading these feminist movements that were going on, did you look at like I mean, did you look into Hoover at all? Did you see anything about like there was a theory out there, and I swear to God I can show you the photo for it, but it's Hoover in a dress. I thought it was a conspiracy, but that was
It's more than a theory. Yeah, Hoover's second in command was Clive Olson. They were clearly a a homosexual couple. I don't want to claim them for my community, but they were clearly a couple. Hoover promoted uh, Clive Tolson to be his second in command. They had a very intimate relationship. They were together always. There's really no doubt, I think, that this was what we would have called a gay relationship, but Hoover was more interested in the power that he had as the director of the FBI, and he was perfectly willing to sell out what should have been his community.
Well, people say that's a conspiracy, but I say he was just a hypocrite. And that's the thing is like there was just a guy recently who was in a high place of political office and he protested the gay bill. Or he supported the don't say gay bill. And then he was at his gay son's wedding where it was like, what the like I don't get it. It's like a double standard here. And it's like, but that's throughout society. So like you see past history of that and you see that happening today as well, too.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's hypocrisy, but it's more than hypocrisy. It's a lust for power over everything else, over honesty, over a sense of justice, and over human decency.
Well, the dangers
And
start to
J.
be
Edgar Hoover was a perfect example of that.
well, it leads into Harvey Milk is the kind of the thing I'm hinting at because eventually throughout, if you look through Hoover's kind of COINTELPRO with the Black Panther Party, you start looking at a bunch of stuff. Well, you see a lot of these voices that are speaking out about something, either trying to get rights or trying to speak out in the name of freedom and the people, in a sense. And Hoover's name kind of goes through all these monoliths like MLK, and his name pops up everywhere. Where I start going, how many activists were speaking out about something and were politically maybe discouraged or threatened or somehow vote manipulation. I don't know, just because they didn't want someone who had a different maybe viewpoint that they deemed unholy or they deemed wrong or sin. And that's when I look at Harvey Milk. I looked at his brief biography. I don't know everything. I'm hoping you could maybe enlighten me on some things. But when he went for political office, I go in my head before I even know if he even made it in. I just start going, someone is going to do something to make sure he does not get in there. And it does not matter who it is. If you know the politics and the climate back then, you know they will do whatever because they see that as they're doing the right thing and they're not.
Well, the 1970s was a very interesting period. Incidentally, my book about Harvey Milk is called Harvey Milk, His Lives and Death, published by Yale University Press in 2018. Harvey Milk was a fascinating figure. He actually began his voting life as a Republican and an avid supporter of Barry Goldwater in 1964. He was very conservative. He was gay, but extremely closeted in the 1950s, as one had to be, and through much of the 1960s as well. And then something happened in the 1960s. For one, he had a huge transformation. He had been working on Wall Street. He became a hippie. He became very interested in theater. He was an actor. He was an associate producer on Broadway. He worked with Tim O'Horgan, who was the director of Hair and Jesus Christ Superstar. And then he realized he would never be a really successful actor. He was kind of at a loss about what to do and where to go. And he and his lover at the time decided that they would move to San Francisco. San Francisco, by the early 1970s, was a very interesting place. The Castro area, in particular, was becoming very gay, especially gay male. It was kind of like a boys' town, as we used to say, a refuge for young gay men all over the country. Harvey moved there with Scott Smith, his lover, in 1972. And Harvey was very charismatic and very determined to do something with his life, although he still wasn't sure in 1972, when he was already 42 years old, what that would be. And he became very inspired by the Watergate hearings. He was just so furious at Nixon. He would watch the Watergate hearings every day and just talk to the screen and say, "You crook, you damn crook!" And he just decided he would do something. And he thought maybe he should go into politics. And so he'd only been in San Francisco for 1 year, but there was already something called the Alice B. Toklas Democratic Club. You can understand how closeted the club was because most people didn't know who Alice B. Toklas was. Alice B. Toklas was a lesbian and the partner of Gertrude Stein, but unless you knew who Gertrude Stein was and unless you were a literary person, you didn't realize that Alice B. Toklas was a lesbian. And so it was kind of a message to gay people that this is a gay democratic club. Harvey approached the head of the Alice B. Toklas Democratic Club and said, I want to run for office. Will you support me? And the head, whose name was Jim Foster, just looked at this guy who had just come to San Francisco and who was a New Yorker and who hadn't done anything for the gay community. And he said, no, we will not support you. You can't dance unless you put up the chairs, and you've never put up the chairs. That is, you haven't done anything for the gay community. And so he didn't get support from the Alice B. Toklas Democratic Club, the lone gay Democratic club in San Francisco, but he ran anyway for the San Francisco City Council, and he lost. He was determined, though, that he wanted to run for public office, and so he ran again for the San Francisco City Council. This time he did a little better. His name was better known. This was in 1975. He lost again. They in a citywide election, even in 1975, a gay person would not be elected. He ran again in 1976, this time for the state assembly, and he lost again. But each time he ran, he got more and more votes because he was very charismatic, and there was a lot of interest in what he had to say, particularly in the liberal community and the gay community. So he decided he would give it one more shot. He ran for a fourth time in 1977. And what changed is that votes for the San Francisco City Council were no longer citywide, they were by district. And so he ran in a district that covered the Castro, which was gay, and Noe Valley, which was liberal and had a lot of lesbians in it, and the Haight-Ashbury, which had a lot of hippies. And this time he won. He became a member of the San Francisco City Council, and he was only there for 11 months. But in the 11 months, he did some remarkable things, not only for the gay community, but for the elderly. He was interested in rent control. He was interested and led the charge in boycotting the city's relationship with South Africa. There was a South African embassy in San Francisco. A lot of companies did business with South Africa. And he led, as I said, the charge to boycott. And before South Africa got rid of its apartheid policies in 1990, 120 cities and counties followed that charge. So Harvey Milk was very innovative and really a leader, but it couldn't last. And this gets back to your question about reaction against gay people having power, particularly in the 1970s. There was another member of the city council by the name of Dan White, who ran in San Francisco's one conservative district and got elected. He was very young. He was only about 30. Like Harvey, he had never been in political office before. He won by promising that he would rid San Francisco of its social deviants, meaning especially gay people. And he never got along with Harvey. There was all sorts of conflict between them. Eventually, Dan White quit his job because it was really too much for him, and members of the city council did not, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say city council, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors did not earn a very high salary. It was meant to attract members of the general society in San Francisco and not politicians. And so they got, this was in 1978, they got a little over 9,000 a year. So Dan White said he couldn't support a family on that. He was really way above his abilities in being on the board of supervisors. And so he quit. And suddenly he decided that he was sorry he quit. He wanted his job back. He asked the mayor, George Moscone, to reinstate him. George Moscone said he would think about it. Harvey urged Moscone not to reinstate him. I think Dan White suspected that it was Harvey and other liberals on the board of supervisors, such as Carol Silver, who were opposed to the reinstatement. In any case, when Dan White discovered he was not being reinstated, he went to City Hall, first killed the mayor, George Moscone, then walked across the corridors of City Hall to the where the Board of Supervisors had their offices, and killed Harvey Milk. His murder of Harvey Milk was not only that he suspected that Harvey Milk disliked him because Dan White was such a homophobe, but also because Harvey Milk was gay. So I think that it was just a prime example of the hatred of the right going to a great extreme and assassinating perhaps the most prominent member of the gay community in the United States.
When he was arrested after assassinating both those people, did he make any statements? What was the answer that he gave?
The answer that he gave, and the answer at his trial, which was really absolutely shocking. His lawyers argued that Dan White was a fine, upstanding person who would not, if he were sane at the time, would not have killed two people. But he was so upset over losing his job on the board of supervisors that he subsisted for 2 weeks on a diary of Twinkies and Coca-Cola. That is, he was out of his mind. It was, yes, it was a sugar derangement. It came to be called the Twinkie defense, and the jury went for it. And so instead of Dan White getting at least life in prison, and at that time, California even had a death penalty, instead of Dan White getting either one, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for a double murder of two political figures, George Moscone and Harvey Milk. And he got out for good behavior after about 6 years, and he eventually killed himself. It's a tragic story all the way around.
The reason why I asked about the testimony or what excuse he gave was because, like I said, they're doing the JFK assassination. If you look at the Warren Commission volumes, Jack Ruby was said that he never knew Dallas police officers, which we know now is a complete false lie. But the thing was that his heart went out to Jackie Kennedy about JFK's death, and that's why he killed Oswald. Well, Tom O'Neill, he's works for The Intercept. He wrote a book about the Manson murders. Well, he discovered like the MK Ultra program was tied in with Ruby, and in his explanation, he explained that the lawyer came out later and stated that he created a fabrication that Jack Ruby had an epileptic seizure and shot Oswald. And it just didn't make sense. So I was like, is this a common thing? Are people questioning it back then? Like, I mean, how many people, when this guy made a statement about being on Twinkies and Coke, did they really buy that? Did the public just accept it and move on? Or were there a lot of people like, that's not why?
Well, the gay community certainly didn't accept it, and all of our supporters. And by 1978, there was considerable support. All of our supporters didn't accept it. So when Harvey and George Moscone were assassinated by Dan White, um, there was a candlelight vigil, very peaceful. This was in November of 1978. Um, Tens of thousands of people showed up. There was great mourning. When the jury gave its verdict in 1979, in May of 1979, tens of thousands of people showed up at City Hall again, but this time to riot. It was called the White Nights Riot. It went on, um, causing great destruction, millions of dollars of destruction. But that's how angry people were, just the absurdity of that verdict. This guy kills two public officials and gets sentenced to 8 years in prison with time off for good behavior. And I think another thing that happened is that Harvey Milk became a martyr in the gay community. And it was really, in some ways, the beginning of more widespread gay militancy and determination to fight for our rights. One result was that there had been talk for several years of a march on Washington, like Martin Luther King's 1963 march for jobs and freedom in the Black community. This was going to be a similar march for the gay community, but the community just couldn't get it together. There was talk throughout the 1960s and the 1970s of such a march. There was so much sorrow and anger as a result of the assassination of Harvey Milk that in 1979 there was a march on Washington and 100,000 people showed up. And it was the first time, I think, that the nation understood that we stood in solidarity, that we were determined to fight for our rights, was covered in all of the major newspapers. And in some ways, I think it was a true beginning of a militant and a political movement. There had been various things going on in the 1970s, but they were beneath the radar of the straight community. But I think this March on Washington, done at least in part in honor of Harvey Milk and out of sorrow about his assassination, I think that that really caught the attention of a lot of the American public.
This might sound like a dumb question, but I'm wondering if anybody chose to memorialize him around the either in the area that he was, the council of, or he was, being elected in. I mean, I'm
Oh,
just
yes.
okay.
Memorialized not only in San Francisco, but everywhere. There are so many Harvey Milk streets around the country. President Obama gave Harvey Milk the Medal of Freedom posthumously. Um, in California, there's an annual Harvey Milk Day. All over the country, there are Harvey Milk breakfasts, which are huge fundraisers. I'm living in San Diego, and I've been to a number of those Harvey Milk breakfasts. They're attended by corporate heads and people from the community, and they raise literally hundreds of thousands of dollars for scholarships for gay youth and other gay concerns, LGBTQ concerns. Not a word that, or not an alphabetism that Harvey would have known when he was assassinated in 1978, but our present alphabetism.
When did the actual besides the march, or the riot, besides that, when did there start to be real acknowledgement of government change when bills started to becoming passed? Was that not until later? I mean, or was there an
No,
acceptance of
was
it?
happening. It was happening slowly, and I don't want to suggest that it happened only because of Harvey Milk. For instance, in the 1970s, before Miami-Dade added sexual and affectional preference to its anti-discrimination ordinance, there were already 40 cities and counties around the country that had that kind of anti-discrimination ordinance. Harvey was the first gay man to win public office in 1978, but before he won public office in 1974, two lesbians, Elaine Noble in Massachusetts, she was elected to the assembly, and Kathy Kozachenko in Ann Arbor, Michigan, was elected to the Ann Arbor City Council, and they were out as lesbians. So it was happening slowly. Organizations had been formed, such as the Lambda Legal Defense Fund, it formed in 1973, and they were determined to fight for gay causes legally around the country. They became a national organization. So there were all sorts of small things that were happening. And then Harvey came along and became the gay community's Martin Luther King, in effect, because he was assassinated. Um, and then, of course, AIDS came along in the 1980s. And I think many straight people realized that someone they loved was gay, because so many gay men had AIDS and were dying of AIDS. And the gay community became more and more our allies to fight for our rights. Still in the 1990s, though, even with fairly liberal politicians, there was a lot of homophobia. It's hard to imagine that Bill Clinton, who had actually promised the gay community that he would fight for our rights in 1992 when he was running for president, he was the one who signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell into law. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was supposedly an improvement over what had existed before, which was a wholesale witch hunting of homosexuals in the military. But it really wasn't an improvement. The witch hunting continued with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it was also Bill Clinton who signed the Defense of Marriage Act. I think many liberal politicians were more politicians than they were liberal, even into the 1990s. And many states passed their own Defense of Marriage Act in the 1990s. But despite that, I think we were winning more and more rights. There were more and more city ordinances that were protecting the rights of LGBTQ people by the 21st century.
I know I'm bringing it back to the Harvey riot again, but it wasn't just gay people that were rioting. It was just all people in that sense. What I do is I try and put out this best in us aspect in all people. I believe that a lot of people obviously will say something and they necessarily deep down when it comes to something as graphic as a complete injustice of being assassinated, um, they realize the error in that and they realize that's a horrible thing that just happened. It doesn't matter what that person's gender or beliefs are. That's when people stand together. And that's kind of, it sucks that we have to, that there's martyrs in our society who do have to, that pay that price for people to have these individual freedoms. But it, the number of people that come together when they see something like that, at that point, there's no matter of ideology that steps in the way. The moral thing is that a person was just killed because the underlying factor of whatever that belief is the same thing with Martin Luther King. It wasn't just black people that were rioting or protesting, it was white people as well too. And
Yeah,
that's
I,
kind of
I
like,
think you're exactly right. Yeah.
that's the best in us as people, is that, and I'm happy that the tides have obviously changed, where I grew up in a time where I didn't know anything about any of this and there was none of that discriminating factors, at least none that I could really tell. I'm sure it's always existed. There's always people with beliefs, but those people don't need to change. It's about, most of society will just reject them because that's where the tides of society are going right now. And the tides of society are going for equal rights and all of these things that everyone is entitled to as an American or as whoever you are. And I think that's really important because like there's a lot of like whenever there's a gender studies talk that I've done or an LGBTQ talk, I end up getting talked down to. And it's like you can't shame someone for asking questions. I don't know anything about any of these things. And when you walked me through this very nicely, and I appreciate that. But it's about the education aspect. A lot of people are not taught these things. And I can see both sides of people that want to reject it and people that want to accept it. And I just go, you got to let people be people. I mean, I have family that's gay, so it's like to me it was just normalized. I never even thought to question it. I never thought any of that type of stuff, but it can be like that when you really boil it down to a person who's just entitled to be married, a person who's entitled to have a kid if they want to adopt. They have as much as rights as a human being. It's like our political parties now that defines us. It's like, are you left or you right? It's like, does that matter? You were given a name. I hope for, you identify by that name.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think to me, it's remarkable how society has changed to open up to LGBTQ people. The latest statistic I read about, attitudes towards same-sex marriage is 71% of Americans approve of same-sex marriage. In the 1990s, all of these states were passing defense of marriage acts. I think it was so hard for straight people, particularly, to conceive of the fact that what many of us want is what they want. We want to live with the person we love. We want to be recognized by the law. We want the benefits that straight married couples have always had. But I think now straight people understand that for the most part. Something like 42% of Republicans approve of same-sex marriage. It's a remarkable figure, really, particularly coming from the position that I come from, having um, come out into the lesbian community in the 1950s. The the changes have been absolutely astonishing.
Now, this is just from your own personal research and experience. Do you think lesbian was more accepted than being gay?
No, I don't think that's particularly true. I think there was a time, and I write about this in a couple of my books, in the 18th century and the 19th century, even in the early 20th century, when women in same-sex relationships could, quote, get away with it as gay men couldn't, because it was so hard for most of society to conceive of women being autonomously sexual. There had to be a man in a sexual relationship. Women were passive. And I think straight people didn't think that not all women want to be sexually passive. And so when two women lived together, they were thought to be roommates, or they were thought to be romantic friends, or living in Boston marriages, as the phrase was in the late 19th century. So lesbians were able to, quote, get away with it, as homosexual men could not. But I think that there was discrimination against lesbians in the 20th century and into our era, just as there was against gay men. For instance, there was witch hunting of lesbians who worked in government positions in the 1950s in the McCarthy era, just as much as there was of gay men.
There's the reason I brought that up was in movies, usually you'll see two girls kiss and the audience goes, "Oh," like, it's like something like that. But that was like a thing in a movie where the guys would be like, "Yes," and they'll be like hitting each other on the shoulder or something like that. But then when it's two guys doing it, everyone kind of gets a little bit uncomfortable or it gets awkward or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that's becoming less the case. Brokeback Mountain, for instance, had great popular success, and of course, it was a wonderful film, and the two lead roles were played by two straight men, and so presumably there's less stigma than there had been, certainly in the 1950s or even into the 1990s.
Now, when it comes to your own personal experience of being involved in all of these movements, I mean, do you see a lot of people just asking questions and kind of changing, just their ideas of things? I feel like a lot of society is so ingrained with so much, but like we mentioned earlier about like religion being kind of lower and a bunch of other societal shifts. There's more people that just want to know more about whatever any of these organizations, any of these movements that are going on, and just asking questions.
Yeah, I find astonishing openness, astonishing only from the perspective of history and my personal experience in other eras. I think most Americans are open. Most Americans do support equal rights for LGBTQ people. Most Americans want to understand what life is like for LGBTQ people. And I see it in the media. I'm a news junkie, and so I spend a lot of time watching TV news, and that means I spend a lot of time watching commercials. And it's astonishing to me that in commercials there's so much diversity, not only racial diversity, but very often nowadays lesbian couples and gay male couples and transgender people. And that would not have existed even 10 years ago, even a decade ago. So I see a growing openness, and I hope it continues. And the recent election has given me reason to hope, because what it shows is that America isn't going to go off into the crazy right, that there's really a reaction to that. America is much saner than I feared at one point it was becoming.
Well, Miss Faderman, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links and also any books or Twitter, Facebook, anything you'd like to promote?
Yes, my books are all on Amazon. You can find me on Wikipedia, and you could find me on lillianfaderman.net. Thank you for having me, Robbie. I enjoyed it.
I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.